What happened after God stopped them from completing the Tower of Babel, and how did that change the world as we know it today?
And shamanism was closely linked with the birth of the Nephilim. It was
Right.
just leading to another chapter.
We know that in this area was Eridu, and then the god of Eridu we know is Enki, and he rebuilt it, so it was before the flood.
Religion that's going to go with the people all around the world and then reinforced by whoever that they're moving in. And if there's parts of the world where giants haven't sort of begun, then they're still going to have a version of that tradition. And that starts to explain why you get such a disparate account of flood stories all over the world after the flood. And a lot of them carry the Tower of Babel stories. It just provides a sort of consistent way as to how it gets there.
The time of Gilgamesh, they were the ones that informed him and was played an important role in the building of the walls, the great walls of Uruk.
You have this migration into China at some time later that's going to bring Taoism, which is based in ancient Sanskrit and Hinduism.
I think with the writing as well, some of the nations or cultures, even if we look at the Chinese, when they first started, they also worshipped the god Most High. At the time of Babel, Nimrod was basically the world ruler, and Makar, a new world order that tried to bring forth a kind of antichrist before its time, so God stopped it. How far away do you think we are from this, and why? What happened after God stopped them from completing the Tower of Babel, and how did that change the world as we know it today? That is what we're going to talk about today, but I'm not alone. I invited two experts today. Dr. Willem McLoud, Gary Wayne, welcome.
Well, thank you for inviting us back.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward.
Yeah, so the languages are changed as a result of applying this knowledge. And it's designed that they're not going to be able to take all of this knowledge with them and continue to develop. It's just to stall this application, so to speak, of this forbidden knowledge. And so all the languages are changed and then they're dispersed to the four winds. And so it's going to take a long time to start to recover, build civilizations. Whereas if they were working as one, this would happen a lot quicker and they would have whatever copies, however they recorded, oral tradition, otherwise, to be able to maintain this knowledge. So this takes the story of the flood with them. And they're going to be moving into people who are aboriginals in the land. So the people of Japheth are moving in with the Indo-Aryan groups that are known as like the Scythians. And into Rome, you're going to have descendants of Japheth moving into people called the Etruscans. These are the Proto-Romans. These are the Proto-Greeks. And they're going to already have that religion, just as in the Indus Valley, already established. And they're going to have their version of that religion as it was being applied at Babel. And so now you're going to take these initial stories and they're going to be duplicated all over the world with different changes that may happen and different local religious things that are coming about, but it keeps the world apart as opposed to together, because it's not permitted to come back together again like that until the end time. So it kind of succeeds in what God wants it to do, to delay this inevitable thing that's going to happen when it's permitted to happen or when it's ordained to happen. So I think that changes everything. And so you have this religion that's going to go with the people all around the world and then reinforced by whoever that they're moving in. And if there's parts of the world where giants haven't sort of begun, then they're still going to have a version of that tradition. And that starts to explain why you get such a disparate account of flood stories all over the world after the flood. And a lot of them carry the Tower of Babel stories. It just provides a sort of consistent way as to how it gets there. And
Yeah.
it's becomes one of those common legacies that is otherwise unaccountable for or accounted for. And it also explains why they're duplicating the same types of architecture that they're wanting to build. Why the pantheons are so similar, just different vernacular names. Why the polytheist rituals are similar, but just different names. Because it's all part of the common history.
Right. Just packaged differently. Willem, do you want to respond to that or add anything?
Yeah, so I think what is also important is how we should understand this confusion of language, which God used to stop this whole project. And what is quite interesting is that there are actually two words used for language in chapters 10 and chapter 11 of Genesis. In chapter 10, we read how all the different nations, it's the table of nations, how they spread throughout the world. And then we read how each of them had their language. So the impression that one gets is as the different people spread all over the world, languages evolved. Now, the word used in this case is lasho. So this is the typical word used for language. Now, what is interesting is that the word used in chapter 11 in the story of the Tower of Babel is not the same. The word used here is sapa. Now, this is it refers to language, but also to speech. So the question is, what does this mean? Why this difference? So I don't understand this passage as saying that language originated at the Tower of Babel. The way that I understand it is that different languages evolved as the peoples of the world spread throughout the world. So I understand this totally different. I believe that Sapa refers to something else. It refers to a new way of pronunciation, of pronouncing words. So it was exactly at the end of the Uruk period that something fascinating happened. And this was when phonetic script was first developed. So it was the first time that any people on earth, but when the Sumerians started using the different symbols in a phonetic way. So they combined these symbols, and this is the first time that we find phonetic writing in the history of the world. Now, before that time, writing had during the Uruk period slowly but steadily come into use. According to tradition, it was actually in Merkar that introduced writing. And what is now interesting is before phonetic writing that happened and came into existence at the end, right at the end of the Uruk period, the peoples of Sumer, which included Semites, which included Sumerians, which included most likely Elamites, and there might have been other peoples also. Each of them read the words or the signs differently. They pronounced it differently. But once phonetic writing came into use, only the Sumerians would have been able to understand the writing. The other peoples, the Semites, the Elamites, none of them, except if they knew Sumerian. But otherwise, they would not have understood it. So the way that the words was pronounced, that the signs was pronounced, changed. And this must have led to a massive confusion. And we do find exactly during this period that there was rebellions and wars that broke out, that the Dumuzi was killed, he lived according to the king list during this period. And also that the Tower of Babel, which I see as the sanctuary at Eridu, was suddenly all the people that was involved in this sanctuary, all the priests, everybody just left the place and went away from there. Got dispersed exactly as we read in the Bible. So we have a remarkably consistent picture that we find in the Bible, also in history and confirmed in archaeology. So in my mind, this is what happened there, and God used that to disperse these people, to stop this project. But at that time, some of the Nephilim families actually went towards I believe, the western parts of the world. Later on, some of them came to Canaan from about, especially later on during the Akkadian period. And then it was in Canaan that we later on find the Nephilim. And some of these very same traditions from there speak Greece, where in the Mycenaean period we have a very strong tradition regarding giants and all these things that we know from the Bible regarding the land of Canaan, also other extra biblical sources. And from there, they actually spread even further through the world. So in my research, I followed them throughout history, this tradition, and they also spread to Europe. And eventually we find that some of these bloodlines, some of these families are still in the world today. We can trace them back, and they play an important role behind the scenes, and they are prominent figures in secret societies like the Rosicrucians, etc. So the fact that they were dispersed was not the end of the story. It was just leading to another chapter in the story. So there are many chapters in the story of the Nephilim, and especially since I see the Tower of Babel closely connected to the Nephilim that arose after the time of the deluge. This is actually where my emphasis falls. Yeah.
Gary, did you want to add anything there?
Yeah, I did, because I think understanding the evolution of the languages is helpful when you're trying to understand the history and the words.
Right.
And so there is an evolution. So, for example, in ancient Semitic, there was no vowels at the beginning. And for something like Nephilim, it would be NPL. Raphaim would be RPM. Kadim would be QDM, right? For the Cadmonim. And so we have vowels that are inserted. That's going to change the emphasis and the syllable pronunciations as it starts to be added in elsewhere in different kinds of ways. And so that's one of the changes. And the H, for example, in Hebrew gets entered in later behind the P and transitions like that. So as we look at that, then we look at some of the transliteration, so to speak, in terms of the letters are pronounced a little bit differently in other languages. So Gilgamesh is in Sumerian, if I have my memory correctly, is a B sounding. In Akkadian, it's a G sounding. Or it's the same pronunciation initially for the sound, but it separates, that you get two different sounds to those letters. The D and the T is another classic example across languages as this sort of develops. So when we get like in Aten in Egypt with a T, that's the same one that's used as the D in Hebrew for Adon, as you would pronounce it that way. And it's important to understand that, particularly when you're understanding some of these terms for giants, like in the Ugaritic text, you have the assembly of the Ditanu, Ditanu, which are the giant tribes of the Rapium or the RPM giants. And that's the same as Dedan in Hebrew. It's also the same as Titan in Greek, where that D and the T are essentially the same pronunciation and or kind of interchangeable. But as we get into the more modern languages, we tend to be more firmer on the separation of the spelling or the pronunciations of that. And just as you have a evolution of the W sound to a V sound in Hebrew from Yahweh to Jehovah, right? That's all part of, and so when we're looking at connections, we need to sort of be sensitive to those types of developments that can help us identify common patterns and events and peoples and words that can help us understand prehistory. So I just want to underline what Willem was talking about there. It's an important consequence or manifestation or evolution that helps us to dig a little bit further back and glean hopefully a little bit more information and commonalities.
Yeah, thank you for explaining that. I think with the writing as well, some of the nations or cultures, even if we look at the Chinese, right, they have different kinds of religions today. But long ago, when they first started, they also worshiped the God Most High. And it was written also in a star form, right? But with a line above it, just to say that there's nothing above the God Most High. So you can kind of trace these things back in history. And I just want to ask you guys, maybe you've heard of this before, but when they look at all the languages in the world, they try to research and see what is the first language that ever started, but they couldn't find it. There was it's like a circle with a few languages that feels like all of those languages had their own original beginning. Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, I would say the most common one is the Indo-Aryan language as the sort of older religion. And it almost is a separate religion that may have been used than what comes out of Babel. Or maybe it was all one language for all kinds of people at that time. We don't know. But if you're going to use some words like Mithra, I mean, that is an Indo-Aryan word, Mitra. The H isn't there, just as Mithra is the god of the Zoroastrians, and Mitra means in Sanskrit a bond or an alliance, and is an ancient association with one of the gods of the antediluvian era there. And so you get those sort of constants that Sanskrit and Indo-Aryan is just a branch of the same language, and it seems to be the Proto, which is why I think they arrived in secular understandings calling it Proto-Indo-Aryan or Proto-Indo-European, whatever you want to call it. But I end up taking like a lot of these words back to the Indo-Aryan because I want to know where some of these terms come from. And one of the classic crazy examples is the word CERN, or CERN, or KERN, which means a horned-headed god in Indo-Aryan, which is connected to horned-headed satyr gods after the flood. And
Wow.
And also the acronym that's used at CERN. Not that they say that that's the word they're using. They have a different acronym, but
Right. Yeah.
that's
It's
just the story that goes with it. So
Yeah, it's fascinating when we look at language because we need to understand these time periods within the language that these people spoke, right? Because we live in their language, and it is extremely important. But I want to delve a little bit more into this. That after the Tower of Babel, how the religion, the pantheistic religion, spread throughout the world. I just want to dive in, and maybe we can use an example of one culture, for example, maybe in India and people today, if we can talk about that a little bit. But I just want to make it clear that the Bible says this in Deuteronomy 32, verse 17. They sacrificed to demons that were no God. So we know these were fallen angels that came down, and people could look at them as gods, right? Because they're powerful. But it says here, they sacrificed to demons that were no God, to gods they had never known, to new gods that had come recently, whom your fathers had never dreaded. There's also another verse where it talks about Abraham, where he comes from, right? His fathers, that they worshiped other gods. And so these are fallen angels. But maybe we can just talk a little bit on that, on how these religions spread from the Tower of Babel. And that is how we have most of the religions even today.
Yeah, so I've already mentioned that the tradition of the great Uruk heroes spread throughout the world, throughout the ancient world. This is one of the traditions that is actually quite interesting because it's in all traditions, it forms the earliest layer of tradition. For example, in the Persian tradition, Gilgamesh agrees with Yamshet. He's called Yamshet in the Persian tradition. And in the Indian tradition, he is called Yama. When one studies these things, one finds that in the earliest literature of the Indo-Iranians, we have certain traditions that definitely goes back to ancient Uruk, and in that sense, one can maybe also, with regard to the gods, find some links back. For example, in Yama's case, Yama is, I've already said, Yama or Yama, which agrees with Gilgamesh. I discuss it in detail in my first volume. His earliest ancestor is Kashyapa, where we again have Kash. and which clearly corresponds in the tradition of one compares it with Meshkiach Kasher or Kash, and then the biblical Cush. So we definitely have these traditions that we can study and that we can, in great detail, when we study it in detail, we find these correspondences. But the problem with the religion is that that's not that easy, because later on, especially in the Indian tradition, we have, for example, Zoroaster that came into play. And many of the things changed with Zoroaster. He changed the religion enormously. So the pre-Zoroastric religion was very different. And to some extent, I would say we can follow the pre-Zoroastric traditions definitely back to ancient Sumer and things that happened during that period. But later on, there was a massive change that happened. And also as the tradition spread from India further to the east, to China and those regions, with the Buddha coming into play, so there's a lot of changes that happened on the way. But what is interesting, I would say, is the threat that I would maybe accentuate is mysticism.
Right.
Because what is interesting is the mystics. You have this ancient shamanism that came from the northern mountains, the Zagros Mountains, and was brought down to the land of Sumer already in the antediluvian age. And shamanism was closely linked with the birth of the Nephilim, in my view. Luchal Banda, for example, is described as a great shaman. We read in his epic, it's actually two epics, it's two parts of one epic, but how he went to the mountains. He actually, Markar sent him and the other young men, 7 young men with him as leaders of the army to the land of Arata in the north. And on the way, he got ill, and they put him for dead in a cave. And while lying there, he had this strange experience, and somehow he landed up in the nest of the Anzu bird, which in this case has a clear shamanistic dimension, and how it was kind of initiation ritual, and how he became part of the family of the Anzu bird. It's remarkable. This is the oldest story of shamanism, clearly of shamanism in the world. But he was also the high priest at Kulak. So most likely, this shows that shamanism plays from the beginning and from this early period a very important role in the Urukite religion and at Uruk. Later on, when the Semites took control of the land, we find that An, which corresponds with El, as an opposing religion, became important, and so forth. So the story of the development of religion is another one, and quite an extensive one. But shamanism later on, during the Akkadian period, it evolved a bit, and mysticism came into play. And even the 7 sages that we read about, they were actually shining ones. The word that means the shining one, which is often combined with Gal, which means the huge or large, big shining ones, which would refer to the giants, but the same word is also used. The U is also combined as a description with other signs, as a description of the sages, the 7 sages, even from the time before the deluge, but also after the deluge, in the time of Gilgamesh. They were the ones that informed him and played an important role in the building of the walls, the great walls of Uruk, which is attributed to Gilgamesh. And now in India, we have a very similar tradition of the 7 sages. The 7 sages appears only in this ancient Sumerian tradition, in the Edfu tradition in Egypt, only in the Edfu and not outside the Edfu tradition in Egypt. And then in the early Aryan tradition. So this is interesting, is that the sages, and which is described in this tradition as kind of mystics as people living in the wild, very much like Lugalbamba in his story, unkept, etc. So there's no doubt in my mind that this plays an extremely important role and that it spread throughout the ancient world, and that was a very important part of the early religions of the world.
Yeah.
But as for particular gods, as I've already said, that's not so easy, especially in the period after Zoroastrian.
Interesting. Thank you. Gary, want to add anything there?
Yeah, there's some complexities, and there's certainly going to be some overlaps here in what we talk about, and so I'll try and keep it fairly succinct. So I'm going to
Sure.
start with Babel, and then I'm going to work back, because again, I want to start from the Christian sort of basis and understanding, and then weave things in. So
I like it. Yeah. Over 6,000 years ago, there was a forgotten world with ancient cities like Nippur and Eridu, where men lived for centuries and great heroes ruled, but an evil darkness was spreading. In this world, we followed the story of Uldako, born a slave under an evil kingdom built on power, fear, and lies, but he knew only suffering. Nothing of the mysterious world of beasts, dragons, gods, and clans beyond his chains. But his story would uncover something far greater, a hidden lineage. Descendants of Adam and Seth, guarding a truth the world was losing. Because behind human history there is another war. Fallen beings, Nephilim, and a plan to corrupt everything. But at the center of it all, an ancient prophecy. The coming of a chosen one who would bring light into darkness. Lightborn, Dawn of Darkness. Pre-order right now and step into the beginning.
In Babel, you have the start of what would have been the religion of Noah that gets replaced with the religion of Nimrod, which seems to be the mystical religion, part of the mysteries, the polytheist religion that, and depending on where he gets that from, I'll leave that to other people, but we understand that as the Babel religion, which is the mystical religion coming in the end time. So from there, you have the dispersions of the people. And so you're going to have another pillar set up for Western, if I can put it that way, Western religion in Egypt. So you have Asar that's going to be traveling with Mizraim, which is another name for Osiris. And probably named after one of the members of the pantheons of the gods, or however he comes there. So Azar and Osiris are similar. Osiris is one of the 7 sages in some of the accounts, so I'll be coming back to him. And then around the Mediterranean, that Egyptian cult sort of spreads around, and then you have some sort of influence coming from Sumer as well. But that's the western leg. Then you have the migrations of the people into the Indus Valley and then into the rest of the world that's coming out. So it has the epicenters from the same religions, but from the west we get the Sumer one with the Magi, and we get the priests of Pharaoh as the main proponents in the beginning, but definitely related because it's going with them as they migrate. And so according to the Gnostics as well, that after the migration into the Indus Valley to meet up with the Indo-Aryans that I'll come back to, you have this migration into China at some time later that's going to bring Taoism, which is based in ancient Sanskrit and Hinduism. And then from there, you're going to get the offshoot Southeast religions like Shintoism and other ones like that. So all sort of connecting back to the same sort of pattern of migration after Babel. So what's interesting as well is that you have this Aboriginal people that I was mentioning that are there, like the Indo-Aryans in the Indus Valley or in the land of Sumer, and they're in other places, and they're coming down from the Zagros Mountains, as Willem is talking about. These are different groups of the Indo-Aryan groups, so they're the Aboriginals. So you're getting a proto people there before the migration, which happens 100 years after the flood. So you're going to get a mix of the language, and you're going to get a mix of the religion. It's essentially the antediluvian religion. the mystical Enochian mysticism, as I like to coin it, that crossed the flood. But there's different versions of it. So you're going to get a mix of that. So even in the ancient Scythian pantheon, you're going to have even different names of the gods that the Greeks are going to set down. But it's still based on the same principle of gods and the same pantheon. So when we look at that Indo-Aryan religion, that's the religion of the giants. And so in Sanskrit, we get an example of devas and asuras as the good ones and the evil ones.
Yeah.
Right. And devas is deus in Latin for God. And it would be, as I recall, in Indo-Aryan, it's still with the V as well, because it's just a branch of the Sanskrit. So it is Devas. And these were known as the shining ones, as opalescent beings were. Their offspring were also known as shining ones in terms of the giants. So again, we get this consistency of gods and names and language before they get so evolved that it's really hard to get a ton of those sort of examples, but you can get enough to make those kinds of links. And so when we talk about an interesting aspect of polytheism after the flood, we get something that Willem was talking about as the seven sages. So when we look at the Kisha Maya, Quetzalcoatl is one of these seven sages. Osiris is one of these seven sages. And they're called the Sebeti in Sumer, and the Sebtiu, I think, in Egypt, also known as the Neter gods as well. And these are the seven sages of India. These are seven gods that are restarting civilization and providing knowledge shortly after the flood. And maybe not as in an intense way as might have been done before the flood, but doing the same thing, because nothing is new under the sun. So we get these inexplicable cross-culture stories of these same groups that's going to restart the religion. What we're not told is, are they restarting with the people of Babel first when they do that with the seven sages, or is it being provided to giants, however they show up in all of these different lands? And so when we get into like the Sibylline cult, for example, that's more as you get closer to that proto-religion, and it crosses most of the Middle East religions in various ways, and particularly with the prophetic side. And even in Rome, this is a connection with not only the Greeks with the Sibylline and the Delphi prophecies, but with Romulus and Remus, son of Ares, who produced the bloodlines for the 100 senators. Romulus and Remus originally settles in the 7 hills of Babylon, with Palatine Hill being one of the main hills, and the home for the Sibylline prophecies, with Vaticanus Hill being a sister branch hill that was outside the original walls of the original city. It's now inside after 800 BC when they rebuilt the walls. But this is the religion that the people of Japheth went into and into southern Italy, but you still have different names in there for the Etruscan pantheon. You still have different names in there for the original Scythian pantheon, and the various Indo-Aryan ones from the ones that come from the humans that are going to intermarry with them down the road. But you see this sort of consistent sort of pattern that tells us that Babel was a very important turning point, and the whole world changes in a direction that is, I don't know whether you could consider it a correction, because God wanted people to immediately go down from the mountain and spread out around the world, or it was developing in a different way than what could have if they had stayed as one people. And I'm not sure, because it's hard to speculate on all the different things as to what happened which way, but it seems like God wants this to happen, and he knows the giants are already there, and that this is going to become a Gentile sea that the monotheism was going to be reborn with Abraham is going to be swimming in, and monotheism swims in for the rest of our history.
Right. This is fascinating things to talk about. I want to move on to the next question, but I just want to back up a little bit. So, what you're saying also, Gary, so the Tower of Babel is extremely important because think about this. So we know, as Willem also laid it out, we know that in this area was Eridu, and then the god of Eridu, we know, is Enki, and he rebuilt it. So it was before the flood. So first of all, the devil, of course, I believe, tried to stop the birth of the Messiah, right? The prophecy from Genesis 3, verse 15, the seed of the woman, the seed of the serpent against each other. The Nephilim came. God had to stop it with a flood. After the flood, we see the same thing happening at Babel. God had to intervene again. We see it at Sodom and Gomorrah again. So we see this is happening. And we also know that this is going to connect with the end times again, because it's all through the devil that's trying to do this. And he is pantheistic religion spread. If you think about it, it's smart. If you're the devil and you want to lure people or deceive them away from God, you will give them as many options as you can, right? But also make them actually worship things that look true, which is fallen angels. So the last question, at the time of Babel, Nimrod was basically the world ruler, and Makar, a new world order that tried to bring forth a kind of antichrist before its time. So God stopped it. This is the question this person wrote, but we also know that Nimrod was this kind of world leader at this time because he built actually many cities. The Bible explains it there. Today we know that the devil is trying to achieve this again, a one world government to bring forth not an antichrist, but the antichrist, which God will allow in the last days. How far away do you think we are from this, and why? Willem, I'll give this to you first, and then we'll go to Gary.